A cold case that haunted Colorado for decades has finally been solved. The shocking arrest in the 1992 murder investigation has sent ripples through a community that had almost given up hope for justice. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning of January 9th, 1992, began like any other winter day in Silverton. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, blanketing the small Colorado mountain town in pristine white. Patricia Keller should have arrived at the county records office by 8:30, as she had done faithfully for the past 11 years. When 9 o'clock came and went without any sign of her, Margaret Walsh placed the first of many calls to her friend's home. By noon, Sheriff Bill McBride was pushing open the unlocked front door of Patricia's modest Green Street house, Margaret trembling beside him. The scene inside defied explanation. Patricia's heavy winter boots remained neatly aligned by the door. Her thick wool coat hung untouched on its wooden hook. The kitchen counter was wiped clean, a single cup turned upside down on a dish towel, the lingering scent of lavender soap hanging in the still air. She wouldn't leave without her coat. Not in January, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking as she clutched the doorframe for support. The sheriff nodded grimly, moving toward the back door. Through the window, a single set of barefoot prints was visible in the fresh snow, leading away from the house. McBride followed them across the yard, his brow furrowing deeper with each step. The tracks proceeded in a straight line for about 20 yards before simply vanishing, as if Patricia had been plucked from the earth. "It doesn't make any sense," he muttered, scanning the unbroken snow beyond. By nightfall, the news had spread through every corner of Silverton. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they watched emergency vehicles line Green Street. Father O'Malley arrived to comfort those assembled, his usually jovial face drawn with concern. "Patricia is the most reliable person I know," Margaret told the deputies, her hands clutching a framed photograph of the two women at last summer's town picnic. "She catalogs everything. She notices details others miss. She wouldn't just disappear." David Wilson hovered at the edge of his property next door, watching the scene unfold with visible distress. When questioned, he stammered that he'd heard nothing unusual the previous night. As darkness fell, volunteers with flashlights spread out across the neighborhood. The search revealed nothing. No signs of struggle, no additional footprints, no clues to explain how the county records clerk had vanished, barefoot, into the Colorado winter. In the days that followed, the disappearance of Patricia Keller would transform Silverton from a close-knit community into a place where neighbors eyed each other with newfound suspicion, where locked doors became the norm, and where the question on everyone's lips remained the same. How could someone simply vanish without a trace? The morning after Patricia Keller vanished, Silverton transformed. A town accustomed to the predictable rhythm of mountain life suddenly found itself thrust into chaos. Sheriff Bill McBride organized search parties with military precision, dividing the small community into grids to be combed methodically. "We leave no stone unturned," the sheriff announced from the courthouse steps, his breath visible in the January chill. "Patricia is one of our own." The response was overwhelming. Margaret Walsh, despite her arthritis flaring in the bitter cold, coordinated volunteers at the Avalanche Cafe, which had become an impromptu command center. Neighbors who had only exchanged pleasantries for years now stood shoulder to shoulder, calling Patricia's name into the vast Colorado wilderness. Even the miners, weathered men who rarely involved themselves in town affairs, emerged from the old silver shafts to join the search. They knew the forgotten tunnels and hidden ravines better than anyone. David Wilson, Patricia's quiet neighbor, searched with particular intensity, his face etched with concern that some mistook for guilt. Father Brendan O'Malley led prayer vigils each evening, the church pews filled with worried faces seeking both divine intervention and human connection. "Patricia's spirit is strong," the priest would say, his voice carrying hope even as his eyes betrayed doubt. As the first week passed without a trace, the mood in Silverton darkened. The search radius expanded, but optimism contracted. Mark Keller, Patricia's former brother-in-law, made a brief appearance before returning to Denver, his abrupt departure raising eyebrows among the townsfolk. By the second week, whispers began. At Miner's Tavern, theories flowed as freely as the beer. Maybe she just needed to escape, some suggested. Others spun darker tales of jealous lovers or hidden enemies. The grocery store became another rumor mill, with speculation passing between shoppers like currency. "I heard she had secrets," Helen Bauer murmured to a cluster of women by the produce section. "Nobody just disappears without a reason." Richard Hoffman, whose construction company had recently completed minor repairs on the courthouse, dismissed the gossip with practiced indifference. "Small towns make big stories," he told anyone who would listen. The most unsettling aspect wasn't the wild theories, but the complete absence of evidence. Patricia's footprints in the snow simply stopped, as if she had been plucked from the earth. No struggle, no signs of forced entry at her home, nothing missing except the woman herself. As January gave way to February, the search parties grew smaller. The national media, briefly interested in the mystery, moved on to fresher tragedies. Sheriff McBride's updates became shorter, his promises more measured. Silverton slowly accepted that some questions might never be answered. But for Margaret Walsh, watching from her window as life in town reluctantly resumed its normal pace, acceptance was impossible. Her friend was out there somewhere, and someone in Silverton knew why. As the winter of 1992 deepened, Sheriff Bill McBride found himself with three primary suspects in Patricia Keller's baffling disappearance. The town's whispers grew louder with each passing day, and the pressure to find answers mounted on the sheriff's weathered shoulders. Mark Keller, Patricia's former brother-in-law, quickly became the first person of interest. The divorce between Mark's brother and Patricia had been finalized just 18 months prior, leaving a trail of resentment. Locals at Miner's Tavern recalled Mark's bitter comments about Patricia getting everything in the settlement. When questioned at the sheriff's office, Mark's eyes darted nervously around the room. But his alibi checked out. He had been in Denver that night, with hotel receipts and witnesses to prove it. Father Brendan O'Malley emerged as an unexpected suspect when investigators discovered he had visited Patricia's home 3 times in the week before she vanished. The parish priest appeared genuinely distraught during questioning, his hands trembling as he explained that Patricia had been helping organize church records. "She was meticulous, dedicated," he explained, tears welling in his eyes. "I was merely consulting her professional expertise." The priest's whereabouts were confirmed by Sister Catherine, who testified he had been leading midnight prayer service when Patricia disappeared. Perhaps most unsettling was David Wilson, Patricia's neighbor from across Green Street. The solitary man had always kept to himself, but Sheriff McBride's deputies discovered he had been watching Patricia's comings and goings for months. When confronted, David appeared shaken but forthcoming, admitting to what he called a deep admiration for Patricia. "She always waved to me," he said softly. "Nobody else in town did that." His alibi, being asleep after taking strong medication for a back injury, couldn't be verified, but neither could it be disproven. Each man underwent multiple rounds of questioning. Sheriff McBride's team searched their homes and vehicles, examined their personal effects, and scrutinized their statements for inconsistencies. Yet despite the intensity of the investigation, no physical evidence linked any of them to Patricia's disappearance. As February turned to March and spring began to thaw the frozen ground, hope for a quick resolution melted away. The 3 men remained under the shadow of suspicion, their lives forever altered by association with the case. Meanwhile, the trail grew colder with each passing day. "We're missing something," Sheriff McBride confided to his deputy one evening, staring at the caseboard. "Something right in front of us. But whatever that something was, it remained as elusive as Patricia herself. The details haunted Sheriff Bill McBride for years. Patricia Keller's basement window had been unlocked from the inside, yet showed no signs of forced entry. A porcelain cup sat upside down in her dish rack, meticulously washed and dried, unusual for someone who typically left dishes to accumulate before washing them all at once, according to Margaret Walsh. Most peculiar was the library book on her nightstand, open to page 73, with no bookmark in sight, though Patricia was known to be fastidious about marking her place. "It's like she stepped out for just a moment," Bill would tell new deputies whenever they reviewed the case. But to where, and why barefoot in January? The sheriff's department documented everything. The temperature of her home, still warm. The half-written grocery list on her refrigerator, ending with laundry soap, and even the radio station still playing softly in her kitchen. Each detail suggested an ordinary evening suddenly interrupted. Father Brendan O'Malley, who had known Patricia from weekly church socials, insisted these details revealed something about her final moments. Patricia was methodical, he would say during prayer meetings where her name inevitably arose. Nothing about this scene makes sense unless she knew her visitor. The unlocked window became particularly significant. Located in the basement laundry room, it was typically secured with a simple latch. Investigators theorized Patricia might have opened it earlier that day to vent steam while ironing, a task Margaret confirmed was part of her Sunday routine. But why leave it unlocked in the Colorado winter? David Wilson, living just across the street, told authorities he'd noticed no unusual vehicles that night. His statement, delivered with a nervousness that later cast suspicion on him, only deepened the mystery. The street was quiet, he'd insisted, just like any other night. For 26 years, these small inconsistencies were dissected at the Avalanche Cafe and during lulls at the county clerk's office where Patricia had once worked. Children who weren't even born when she vanished grew up hearing about the woman who disappeared, leaving only footprints in snow that seemed to end mid-stride. Detective Sarah Mitchell would later find these details meticulously documented in faded reports. What frustrated her most was how close her predecessors had come to connecting the dots. The cup, the window, the book, they weren't just random elements of an interrupted life. They were pieces of a puzzle that had been staring back at investigators for decades, waiting for someone to finally see the pattern they formed. But in those early years, the small mysteries only multiplied, offering no answers, just an ever-expanding void where closure should have been. Silverton was never quite the same after Patricia Keller vanished. The town, once characterized by its open doors and easy trust, transformed into a place of whispers and sideways glances. At the Miners' Tavern, conversations would halt when certain people walked in. The friendly waves across Green Street became perfunctory, mechanical gestures stripped of warmth. Margaret Walsh felt the change most acutely. As Patricia's closest friend, she found herself caught in a strange limbo, both a figure of sympathy and subtle suspicion. When she entered the Avalanche Cafe, conversations would shift, as if her presence reminded everyone of uncomfortable questions left unanswered. "I can feel them wondering if I know something I'm not saying," Margaret confided to Father Brendan O'Malley one afternoon after church service. The parish priest nodded solemnly, understanding all too well the burden of being a confidant in a town gripped by fear. The community gatherings that once defined Silverton's charm became breeding grounds for speculation. At the church bake sale, Helen Bauer deliberately avoided eye contact with Sheriff Bill McBride. During PTA meetings, parents who had never shown interest in school affairs suddenly appeared, hungry for gossip rather than educational improvement. Even Mark Keller, Patricia's former brother-in-law, found himself isolated despite being cleared of involvement. His bitter demeanor didn't help matters, each scowl interpreted as guilt rather than grief by watchful neighbors. David Wilson perhaps suffered the most undeserved scrutiny. The solitary neighbor's awkward manner and obvious distress at Patricia's disappearance were misread as suspicious behavior. Children began avoiding his home, and invitations to community events stopped arriving. Margaret alone maintained her routine visits to Patricia's empty house, dusting shelves and watering plants that somehow continued to thrive. Her arthritis was beginning to trouble her even then, but she ignored the pain, determined to keep her friend's space ready for a return she couldn't stop believing in. "You're the only one who hasn't given up," Richard Hoffman told her once, encountering Margaret on her weekly walk to the courthouse memorial bench, a simple wooden seat that would, years later, bear a brass plaque. "It's not about giving up," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "It's about remembering. This town is too quick to forget what it finds uncomfortable." As months turned to years, even Margaret's unwavering loyalty was tested. She kept boxes of photographs, letters, and birthday cards. Physical proof of a friendship the town seemed increasingly willing to relegate to history. Each anniversary of the disappearance brought fewer participants to the informal gatherings she organized, until Margaret stood alone at the bench, her solitary vigil a quiet rebuke to a community eager to move on. By 2008, Patricia Keller's case had become nothing more than a collection of yellowed papers and deteriorating evidence bags, tucked away in a metal drawer at the Silverton County Archive. The once urgent investigation had gradually faded from the town's collective consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies and everyday concerns. Only a handful of old-timers at Miner's Tavern still occasionally mentioned her name over their evening drinks. Detective Sarah Mitchell wasn't from Silverton originally. Fresh from the Denver Police Department with a reputation for tenacity, she transferred to the small mountain town, seeking a quieter pace. During her first week, Sheriff McBride had casually mentioned the Keller case while showing her around the office. "That one haunts this place," Bill had said, his weathered face betraying decades of frustration. "Some mysteries just don't want solving." Something about his resignation sparked Sarah's curiosity. That evening, she signed out the case files and took them home. By morning, she had read every page twice. The detective became increasingly fixated on the inconsistencies. Patricia's boots by the door, the carefully washed cup, the footprints that vanished. These details consumed Sarah's thoughts during her morning runs through Silverton's frost-covered streets. "You're chasing ghosts," Sheriff McBride warned when he noticed the Keller files permanently stationed on her desk. "Better minds than yours have tried." But Sarah persisted. She tracked down retired deputies who'd worked the original investigation, spending her weekends driving to neighboring towns to interview them. She created new timeline charts, pinning them to her apartment walls. She even visited Patricia's old house on Green Street, now occupied by a young family who knew nothing of its history. Margaret Walsh was the only person who encouraged her efforts. The elderly woman invited Sarah for tea, sharing stories about her friend while her arthritic hands carefully turned the pages of photo albums. "Everyone else has forgotten," Margaret said softly, "but I knew her. Patricia deserves better than to be forgotten." Without fresh evidence or witnesses, however, Sarah's investigation stalled. The DNA technology that would later prove crucial didn't yet exist in a form accessible to small-town police departments. The detective requested funding for advanced forensic testing, but the county commissioners denied her proposal, citing budget constraints. For 3 years, Sarah kept the case open on her own time, reviewing the files monthly, hoping for the breakthrough that remained frustratingly out of reach. She became a regular at the courthouse archives, where the clerks saved her the trouble of signing in. "Some cases just stay cold," the sheriff reminded her. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't someone who gave up easily. She simply hadn't found the right key yet. The dusty evidence box had sat in the Silverton County Archive for over 26 years. Detective Sarah Mitchell had examined its contents dozens of times since taking on Patricia Keller's cold case. But this time was different. A small evidence bag containing what appeared to be an insignificant scrap of fabric, once cataloged and forgotten, was about to change everything. "We're resubmitting everything with Touch DNA capabilities," Sarah explained to Margaret Walsh during their weekly meeting at the Avalanche Cafe. Margaret nodded, her arthritic hands wrapped around a steaming mug, hope flickering in her eyes despite years of disappointment. In April 2018, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation called with news that left Sarah speechless. The fabric, likely torn from a work shirt and found caught on Patricia's basement window frame, contained preserved DNA. After running it through expanded databases, they had a match. Gregory Thomas, Sarah whispered, reading the report, a contractor who had worked briefly in Silverton during the winter of 1992, then seemingly vanished. Its name appeared on a single work order for Patricia's house, plumbing repairs completed just 3 weeks before her disappearance. The detective immediately pulled Richard Hoffman's construction company records. Thomas had worked for Hoffman for less than 6 months before abruptly leaving town. No forwarding address, no further employment history in Colorado. He had effectively disappeared from official records until a minor traffic violation in Oregon 10 years later created a DNA record in the system. When Sheriff Bill McBride heard the news, the usually stoic lawman removed his hat and sat heavily in his chair. "After all this time," he murmured, "we might finally get answers." Word spread through Silverton like wildfire. At Miners Tavern, old-timers who remembered the original investigation debated the revelation. David Wilson, Patricia's neighbor who had lived under the shadow of suspicion for years, wept openly when Sarah personally informed him of the breakthrough. Father Brendan O'Malley held a special service that Sunday, where townspeople gathered to process the news. "Truth has a way of surfacing," the priest told his congregation, even when buried beneath decades of silence. For Margaret, the development was both vindication and reopening of wounds. She brought Sarah faded photographs from the early 90s, one showing Richard Hoffman's construction crew at the annual town picnic. In the background stood a thin man with his face partially turned away, Gregory Thomas, the quiet contractor nobody remembered clearly. "I always said someone took her," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Now we have a name." For the first time since Patricia Keller walked barefoot into the snow and vanished without a trace, Silverton had more than just questions. They had a suspect, they had evidence, and most importantly, they had hope for long-awaited answers. Gregory Thomas had spent 26 years building a life as Michael Bennett in Portland, Oregon. He had a modest apartment, worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local hospital, and kept to himself. When federal marshals knocked on his door that crisp May morning in 2018, the color drained from his face. He knew exactly why they were there. The news of his arrest raced through Silverton faster than the mountain winds. Sheriff Bill McBride held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, his weathered face betraying a mix of relief and regret that the case had remained unsolved for so long under his watch. "We never stopped looking," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying across the crowd of stunned residents. "Thanks to Detective Mitchell's persistence and modern DNA analysis, we finally have the break we've been waiting for." At the Avalanche Cafe, locals gathered in hushed clusters, coffee cups growing cold as they processed the revelation. The establishment buzzed with theories and recollections, many struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet contractor they barely remembered with the monster who had allegedly stolen Patricia Keller from their midst. "I hired him once to fix my porch," whispered Helen Bauer, her hands trembling around her mug. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, a guilt she couldn't yet articulate weighing heavily on her shoulders. Richard Hoffman was conspicuously absent from these gatherings. The construction company owner had suddenly announced a fishing trip the moment news broke of the arrest, his abrupt departure raising eyebrows among the townsfolk. Margaret Walsh sat alone in a corner booth, tears streaming silently down her lined face. For her, this wasn't just news. It was the answer to prayers whispered through 26 winters. A younger waitress brought her tea without being asked, squeezing her shoulder in wordless support. "I remember him," David Wilson murmured to no one in particular, his voice barely audible above the cafe's hum. He worked on the Keller house that fall. Patricia mentioned he'd done some repairs in her basement. The neighbor's revelation caused heads to turn, and for a moment, the old suspicions against him flickered in a few eyes before fading away. Detective Sarah Mitchell entered the cafe, immediately creating a ripple of silence. She ordered coffee to go, aware of the stares, but focused on the mountain of work ahead. The detective had already booked her flight to Portland to interview the suspect face-to-face. Outside, television crews from Denver set up equipment, their satellite trucks transforming Silverton's quiet Main Street into an impromptu media center. The mystery that had haunted this mountain community for decades was suddenly national news, and the spotlight would only grow brighter as Gregory Thomas was extradited back to Colorado to face justice. Margaret Walsh arrived in Silverton on a Tuesday morning, the familiar mountain air immediately aggravating her arthritis. At 73, the journey from Arizona had taken more out of her than she cared to admit, but some calls couldn't be ignored. The news about Gregory Thomas had reached her through a phone call from Detective Sarah Mitchell. And within 48 hours, Margaret had packed her sedan with everything that mattered. 6 carefully labeled cardboard boxes containing 26 years of memories. "I've kept everything," she told the detective as they unloaded the boxes at the sheriff's office. Her fingers, swollen at the joints, traced the edge of a weathered photo album. "Every newspaper clipping, every letter Patricia wrote me, even the birthday card she gave me 3 weeks before she disappeared." The detective watched with quiet reverence as Margaret methodically arranged the contents of her personal archive on the conference table. What government databases lacked in human context, Margaret supplied in abundance. She remembered which construction projects were happening in January 1992, which businesses had closed that winter, and most importantly, who had been acting strangely in the weeks before her friend vanished. "Gregory came to fix Patricia's basement window," she explained, pointing to a handwritten note in Patricia's day planner. She mentioned him being overly interested in her record-keeping system at the courthouse, said it made her uncomfortable. Word of Margaret's return spread quickly through town. At the Avalanche Cafe, locals gathered in hushed circles, stealing glances at the elderly woman who sat alone each morning, sipping tea and organizing timeline notes. For some, her presence reopened wounds they'd tried to forget. For others, she became a symbol of unwavering loyalty. "That woman never gave up," whispered Helen Bauer to her breakfast companion, guilt shadowing her face. The former secretary had her own secrets to reckon with. By the end of her first week back, Margaret had established a makeshift headquarters in her rented cottage. The walls were covered with photos, notes, and newspaper clippings, a physical manifestation of her refusal to let Patricia's case fade away. Detective Mitchell visited daily, often bringing James Walker, the district attorney, to review the wealth of contextual information Margaret provided. "She remembers details nobody documented," Mitchell told her colleagues. "The timeline she's reconstructing gives us connections we never saw before." For the residents of Silverton, Margaret's stoic presence on their streets served as both accusation and inspiration. She walked slowly past the courthouse where Patricia once worked, past Miner's Tavern where rumors had first circulated, her arthritic gait a testament to the passage of time and to the persistence of memory. "Some folks think I should let it rest," she told Father O'Malley when he visited her cottage. "But Patricia deserves better than silence. She always did." Detective Sarah Mitchell sat in the dim light of the county archive, surrounded by stacks of yellowed files. The DNA match to Gregory Thomas had broken the case wide open, but she knew there was more to uncover. 26 years of silence couldn't be explained by one man acting alone. Her persistence paid off when Helen Bauer, a former secretary at Hoffman Construction, finally agreed to meet at the Avalanche Cafe. The older woman's hands trembled as she stirred her coffee. "I deleted them," Helen confessed, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. The work order showing Gregory was sent to Patricia's house 3 times that winter. Once for a leaky pipe, then twice more for what he claimed were follow-up checks. Sarah leaned forward. "Why would you destroy evidence in a missing person case?" "Richard made me do it," Helen replied, tears welling in her eyes. "Said it would ruin the company if people thought we hired criminals. I had 2 kids to feed back then. I couldn't lose my job." The detective didn't judge. Instead, she used this confession to confront Richard Hoffman at his sprawling ranch house outside town. The construction company owner, now in his 70s, initially denied everything until Sarah mentioned Helen's statement. "Fine," Richard finally admitted, pouring himself a generous whiskey. "Thomas called me that night, panicking. I never asked what happened, and he never said. But I knew it was bad." The businessman described how he'd given Gregory $5,000 cash to leave town. Told him to start fresh somewhere else. Never thought he'd actually get away with it all these years. Each revelation led to another. Bank records showed a large withdrawal from Richard's account the day after Patricia disappeared. Phone records confirmed calls between Gregory and his boss at unusual hours. Margaret Walsh, reviewing these findings in Sarah's office, shook her head in disbelief. "All these years," she whispered, arthritis-gnarled fingers tracing the timeline Sarah had constructed. "All these years, people knew pieces of the truth and said nothing." The detective nodded grimly. The silence protected everyone except Patricia. As news of these confessions spread through Silverton, more residents came forward with small details they'd dismissed or forgotten. A postal worker who'd seen Gregory's truck parked near Green Street that night. A bartender at Miner's Tavern who remembered Gregory's strange behavior in the weeks before he left town. Layer by layer, the conspiracy of silence that had shrouded Patricia's disappearance was being stripped away. And with each new revelation, Detective Mitchell moved one step closer to the full truth that had eluded Silverton for more than 2 decades. David Wilson sat alone in his living room, staring at the wall that separated his house from what had once been Patricia Keller's home. The home that had remained empty for 26 years, preserved like a time capsule by the county until the investigation was officially closed. Now, with Gregory Thomas's arrest, everything was being unearthed, including David's most carefully guarded secret. Detective Sarah Mitchell had arrived with a search warrant 3 days after Gregory's arrest. The police had been methodically investigating everyone connected to Patricia, leaving no stone unturned. In David's attic, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old tax returns, they discovered what he had hidden for decades, a carefully maintained collection of photographs. "These are all of Patricia," the detective had said, her voice neutral but her eyes sharp with suspicion. David couldn't deny it. Dozens of images captured Patricia gardening, collecting mail, walking to her car, all taken from his window, all without her knowledge. What had once been his private shrine to an unspoken love now looked like the obsessive behavior of a potential killer. "I loved her," he had whispered, his voice cracking, "but I never would have hurt her." The solitary neighbor was taken in for questioning that lasted 18 hours. His home was searched thoroughly, his yard examined with ground-penetrating radar. The community that had once merely regarded him as odd now viewed him with open hostility. Someone threw a brick through his front window. The word "killer" appeared in spray paint across his garage door. Margaret Walsh, despite her own grief, had been the only one to show him kindness during this time. "Patricia always spoke well of you," she told him, her arthritic hands trembling as she brought him a casserole. "She said you were the quietest but most reliable neighbor she'd ever had." Those words had been both comfort and torture to David. When forensic evidence finally confirmed Gregory Thomas's guilt beyond doubt, the police cleared David's name. Detective Mitchell even made a public statement exonerating him. But the damage was done. The community that had turned on him so quickly wasn't as quick to forgive itself. Now, 6 months later, David rarely left his house. The photographs had been returned to him after being cataloged as evidence, but he had burned them all in his backyard fire pit, watching as the flames consumed the last physical reminders of his silent devotion. "I should have told her," he whispered to the empty room. "Just once." Instead, he had watched her from afar, too afraid of rejection to speak. And now, all these years later, he was left with nothing but regret and the impossible task of forgiving neighbors who had been so ready to believe the worst. January 27, 2019, marked 27 years since Patricia Keller vanished from Silverton. As dusk settled over the snow-dusted courthouse steps, hundreds of flickering candles pierced the mountain darkness. Residents young and old gathered, their breath visible in the frigid Colorado air, while news vans with satellite dishes lined Green Street. Margaret Walsh stood near the memorial bench, her arthritic hands cupping a trembling flame. The years had weathered her face, but her resolve remained undiminished. Beside her, Detective Sarah Mitchell surveyed the crowd with cautious optimism. The arrest of Gregory Thomas had transformed what was once a somber remembrance into something electric with possibility. "CNN is here," whispered a teenage girl to her mother. "And I saw that reporter from Denver Post interviewing Sheriff McBride." The national spotlight had found Silverton at last. Cable news channels broadcast live from the vigil, reporters recounting the mysterious disappearance and the shocking arrest that had followed. Their presence amplified both the community's renewed hope and its simmering anxiety about what truths might still emerge. Father O'Malley led a prayer, his aging voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "We pray for Patricia, for justice, and for healing in our community," the parish priest intoned. Some townspeople bowed their heads, others exchanged uncomfortable glances, particularly those who had known Richard Hoffman or Helen Bauer afore their confessions upended Silverton's fragile peace. When Margaret stepped forward to speak, the crowd fell silent. Her voice was soft but carried surprising strength as she addressed not just the neighbors she'd known for decades, but the cameras capturing her words for a national audience. "Patricia wasn't just a name in a cold case file," she began. "She cataloged this town's births, deaths, and marriages. She remembered your children's names. She kept this community's history." Margaret paused, steadying herself against the podium. 27 winters have passed since she walked these streets, but today proves that time doesn't erase the truth, it reveals it. Among those listening were college students from Durango, young people who'd been infants when Patricia disappeared. They'd driven an hour through mountain passes after following the case on social media. Their presence, these strangers moved by a decades-old mystery, visibly affected the older residents. As candles burned low and television crews packed equipment into their vehicles, Detective Mitchell noticed David Wilson standing alone at the edge of the gathering. The neighbor had been cleared of suspicion, but still carried the weight of the community's former mistrust. She watched as Margaret crossed the courthouse lawn and gently took his hand, a small gesture of reconciliation that spoke volumes about the long journey toward healing that still lay ahead. On a frigid February morning in 2019, the Silverton Courthouse opened its doors to a case 26 years in the making. Gregory Thomas, now gray-haired and gaunt, entered the same building where Patricia Keller had once filed county records with meticulous care. The irony hung heavy in the air. A man on trial for murder in the very place his alleged victim had spent countless hours serving her community. Margaret Walsh sat in the front row, her arthritic hands clutching a worn photograph of Patricia. The years had weathered her face, but her eyes remained sharp, missing nothing as she watched the proceedings unfold. She had waited for this moment longer than anyone. Detective Sarah Mitchell moved with quiet confidence between the prosecution table and the gallery. Her obsession with the case had transformed into methodical preparation, each piece of evidence carefully cataloged and ready for presentation. She exchanged knowing glances with District Attorney James Walker, their partnership forged through months of building what once seemed an impossible case. "The evidence will show," Walker began his opening statement, his voice resonating through the packed courtroom, that the defendant deliberately took Patricia Keller from her home that January night in 1992, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that would take decades to understand. The jury, 12 Silverton residents and 2 alternates, leaned forward as the prosecutor laid out the timeline. Walker methodically explained how modern DNA analysis had matched Gregory to the scrap of cloth found near Patricia's home, how work orders connecting him to her residence had been deliberately deleted, and how witness statements would finally complete the puzzle. Sheriff Bill McBride, now retired but still commanding respect, sat rigidly in the second row. The case that had haunted his career was finally seeing daylight. Beside him, several deputies who had participated in the original search watched with solemn expressions. Defense attorney Michael Reynolds argued passionately that circumstantial evidence and faded memories couldn't possibly meet the burden of proof. 26 years is too long, he insisted. Memories change, evidence degrades. My client has been wrongfully accused. But the courthouse walls seemed to hold their own memories. As testimonies began, even the most skeptical observers could feel something shifting. The timeline Walker presented made terrible, perfect sense, connecting Gregory's contracting work at Patricia's home to her disappearance, explaining the barefoot prints, the washed cup, the unlocked basement window. Margaret closed her eyes briefly when photographs of Patricia's empty home were displayed. The courthouse clock ticked steadily forward, marking time in a case where time itself had been both enemy and ally. Justice, delayed but determined, had finally arrived in Silverton. March unfolded like a grim theater production in the Silverton courthouse. Each day, another witness took the stand, their testimonies weaving together the tapestry of deceit that had shrouded Patricia Keller's disappearance for 26 years. Helen Bauer approached the witness box with trembling hands. The former secretary's voice cracked as she admitted to deliberately deleting work orders that would have connected Gregory Thomas to Patricia's home just days before she vanished. "Mr. Hoffman told me it would be better for everyone," Helen testified, unable to meet the eyes of Margaret Walsh, who sat rigid in the front row. "I never thought someone had hurt her." Richard Hoffman followed the next day, his once commanding presence diminished by time and guilt. The construction company owner confirmed he had paid Gregory nearly $5,000 to leave town when rumors began swirling. It was business, he insisted, though his voice betrayed him. The company couldn't afford a scandal. "I convinced myself she had just left town." Detective Sarah Mitchell watched from beside District Attorney James Walker, her notebook filling with connections she'd spent years pursuing. The detective's persistence had finally forced the town's secrets into the unforgiving light of the courtroom. The most devastating testimony came from Carl Anderson, a man who had lived with his silence like a cancer. The local resident, now in his 70s, approached the stand with the heavy steps of someone carrying an impossible weight. "I was walking home late that night," Carl began, his weathered hands gripping the railing. "It was snowing, but I saw someone leaving Patricia's house around 11:30, a man carrying something heavy to his truck." The courtroom fell silent as Carl described the figure moving through the darkness, how the falling snow had partially obscured his view, and how fear had frozen his tongue for nearly 3 decades. "I recognized the vehicle as one of Hoffman's construction trucks," he continued, "but I was afraid of getting involved. My wife was sick then, and I told myself it wasn't my business." His testimony provided the crucial timeline that investigators had sought for years, filling the gap between Patricia's last known moments and her disappearance. Father Brendan O'Malley sat with David Wilson in the back of the courtroom, both men listening as the truth they had long suspected finally emerged. The parish priest occasionally placed a steadying hand on David's shoulder when the testimony became too much to bear. As March drew to a close, the prosecution had constructed an irrefutable narrative of what happened that January night in 1992. a narrative that would finally give Patricia Keller the justice she had been denied for far too long. As testimony in Gregory Thomas's trial continued into its third week, Silverton transformed into a battleground of conflicting loyalties. The once unified mountain community fractured along invisible lines, those who demanded justice at any cost, and those who feared what other secrets might surface if they kept digging. At the Avalanche Cafe, heated debates erupted over morning coffee. "You weren't here back then," Arthur Jenkins told a younger resident. "Some stones are better left unturned." Across town at Miner's Tavern, similar arguments played out each evening, voices growing louder as glasses emptied. The post office became an unexpected flashpoint. Neighbors who had exchanged pleasantries for decades now stood in strained silence, sorting mail into separate camps of belief. Sunday services at Father O'Malley's church grew tense, with parishioners choosing pews based on their stance regarding Gregory's guilt. Richard Hoffman's confession about paying Gregory to disappear had particularly divided the old-timers. Many had done business with the construction company owner for years, attending his barbecues and children's weddings. His involvement struck at the heart of Silverton's self-image as a community where people looked out for one another. "We're not choosing between right and wrong anymore," Margaret Walsh observed quietly to Detective Sarah Mitchell as they watched townspeople argue outside the courthouse. "We're choosing between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths." Her arthritic hands clutched a weathered photograph of Patricia, a silent reminder of what was truly at stake. Detective Mitchell faced the harshest scrutiny. Anonymous notes appeared on her vehicle windshield. "Leave the past buried," one read. The detective found herself excluded from conversations at the grocery store. Met with cold shoulders from those who believed she was tearing apart their community for a case long considered closed. "You don't understand what this is doing to us," Helen Bauer told Sarah during a chance encounter outside the courthouse. The former secretary's eyes were rimmed red. "Some of us have to live here after you're done." Sarah remained undeterred. "Patricia deserved better from all of us," she replied simply. Even Sheriff Bill McBride, who had led the original investigation decades earlier, found himself questioned about why his department had missed crucial evidence. The aging lawman weathered the criticism stoically, publicly supporting Mitchell's work while privately wrestling with his own past failures. Through it all, the trial continued. Each day, James Walker methodically built his case against Gregory Thomas, while the defendant sat impassive. His presence a constant reminder of how thoroughly one person could shatter a community's peace. As April approached, Silverton remained divided, but united in the understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. The old Silverton courthouse had never felt so crowded, yet so silent. April's sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches as closing arguments in Gregory Thomas's trial came to an end. In the front row, Margaret Walsh clutched a folded piece of paper, her arthritic fingers tracing the edges she'd refolded countless times over the past week. "The court calls Margaret Walsh," announced Judge Harriet Simmons, her normally stern voice softening slightly. Margaret rose slowly, her joints protesting after hours on the hard bench. Detective Sarah Mitchell caught her eye from across the room, offering a subtle nod of encouragement. The elderly woman made her way to the stand, passing James Walker, who whispered, "Take your time." The courtroom fell into a hush so complete that the creaking of the old building seemed thunderous. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and unfolded her victim impact statement. 27 years of waiting, of wondering, of keeping Patricia's memory alive, all distilled into 3 handwritten pages. "Patricia Keller was more than a name in your case files," Margaret began, her voice trembling at first but gaining strength with each word. "She was the person who remembered everyone's birthdays. She was the woman who stayed late at the county office to help young couples file their first home deeds. She was my dearest friend." As she spoke of the decades of empty holidays and unanswered questions, Several jurors wiped away tears. Even Gregory Thomas, who had maintained an impassive expression throughout the trial, lowered his eyes to the table. The worst part wasn't just losing Patricia, Margaret continued. It was watching our community fracture under the weight of suspicion. It was seeing good men like David Wilson condemned without evidence. It was knowing someone walked among us, carrying this terrible secret, while we all suffered. Her voice cracked only once, when describing the last conversation she'd had with Patricia about plans for a spring garden they would never plant together. The judge, known throughout the county for her composure, removed her glasses and pressed her fingertips to her eyes. "I don't speak today seeking vengeance," Margaret concluded, looking directly at Gregory Thomas. "I speak for the truth Patricia deserved all along. I speak for a town that needs to heal. Most of all, I speak because silence has already cost us far too much." When she finished, no one moved. The weight of decades of grief and longing hung in the air, finally given voice. Even the most stoic townspeople found themselves overcome. Margaret carefully folded her statement, nodded to the judge, and with quiet dignity, returned to her seat. Her final stand for justice nearly complete. The courthouse fell silent as the jury filed back in on that bright May morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long rectangles across the worn wooden floor where Patricia Keller had once walked daily to file county records. Every seat was filled, with residents standing 3 deep along the back wall. Gregory Thomas sat motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls. When the foreman stood and pronounced the verdict guilty, a collective exhale rippled through the room. Margaret Walsh closed her eyes briefly, her arthritic hands clutching a faded photograph of her friend. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," Judge Eleanor Simmons declared, her gavel punctuating each word with finality. The contractor showed no emotion, maintaining the same stoic expression he'd worn throughout the trial. Detective Sarah Mitchell watched from her seat beside District Attorney James Walker. The verdict represented years of obsessive work, countless sleepless nights poring over evidence that everyone else had missed. Yet the victory felt hollow. Despite the overwhelming DNA evidence from the cloth fragment, Gregory refused to confess or reveal what had happened to Patricia's remains. "The defendant may address the court," Judge Simmons announced. Thomas stood slowly. "I maintain my innocence," he said flatly. "That's all I have to say." When Margaret's turn came for her victim impact statement, the elderly woman rose with difficulty. Detective Mitchell moved to help, but Margaret waved her away, determined to stand on her own. "For 27 years, I've carried Patricia with me," she began, her voice surprisingly strong. "Not just memories, but questions. Did she suffer? Was she afraid? Did she call out for help?" Margaret paused, looking directly at Thomas. "You've taken more than my friend. You've stolen peace from an entire community." Her words cut through the courtroom silence like a knife. Sheriff Bill McBride, now retired but present for the verdict, removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Even Richard Hoffman, who had paid Thomas to disappear years ago, couldn't meet anyone's gaze. "I don't expect your confession today," Margaret continued. "But know this, Patricia mattered, she was loved, and while you'll spend your life behind bars, we will finally begin to heal." As she returned to her seat, Margaret's words hung in the air. The townspeople filed out in silence, some stopping to touch her shoulder in solidarity. The verdict wouldn't bring Patricia back, but for the first time in decades, Silverton could begin to close a chapter that had defined it for far too long. Silverton emerged from the Gregory Thomas trial like a town waking from a 26-year nightmare. The courthouse steps, where reporters had clustered for weeks, gradually emptied as national attention shifted elsewhere. But for locals, the aftermath was just beginning. At the Avalanche Cafe, Conversations shifted from speculation to reconciliation. Richard Hoffman sold his construction company to his nephew, unable to face the community after his role in the cover-up was exposed. The business reopened under a new name, with promises of transparency painted on freshly installed windows. "We've been living with ghosts," Margaret Walsh told a small gathering at the church basement, her arthritic hands wrapped around a steaming cup. "Not just Patricia's, but the ghosts of our own silence." The elderly woman who had never stopped searching for her friend became an unlikely symbol of perseverance. Young people sought her out, listening to stories about Patricia Keller with newfound reverence. Detective Sarah Mitchell found herself in an unexpected position. The case that had consumed her professional life was closed, yet closure remained elusive without Patricia's remains. She spent evenings reviewing notes, hoping Gregory might eventually reveal that final secret. During days, she walked Green Street, nodding to residents who once viewed her with suspicion, but now offered quiet thanks. David Wilson, once ostracized for his hidden affection for Patricia, slowly reintegrated into community life. The revelation of his innocence prompted many to examine their own rush to judgment. He volunteered at the library, cataloging local history, including the very case that had nearly destroyed him. Father Brendan O'Malley held a service of reconciliation, addressing the fractures that had divided his congregation. "Truth and justice arrived late," he said, his voice echoing through the small church, but they arrived nonetheless. Sheriff Bill McBride, now retired, visited the station to shake Mitchell's hand. "You did what I couldn't," he admitted, the weight of decades of failure finally lifting from his shoulders. Helen Bauer left town without farewell, her role in concealing evidence making her continued presence impossible. Her empty house on Maple Avenue stood as another reminder of how secrets had hollowed out the community. For Mitchell, watching Silverton's slow healing process brought complicated satisfaction. Justice had been served, but at tremendous cost. Walking past the courthouse one evening, she noticed Carl Anderson sitting alone on the memorial bench, his delayed testimony still weighing on him. "I keep thinking about all those years," he told her when she joined him. "All that time wasted." Mitchell nodded. "But not the years ahead," she replied, as the mountain shadows lengthened across the town that was finally learning to face its past. The June morning dawned clear over Silverton, washing the courthouse square in golden light. Nearly 30 people gathered around the weathered wooden bench where for years only memories of Patricia Keller had sat. Today, that would change. Margaret Walsh arrived early, her arthritic fingers clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. She settled carefully onto a folding chair in the front row, nodding to Detective Sarah Mitchell, who stood respectfully to one side. The detective's presence was both professional and personal now. The case had changed her as much as it had changed the town. "It's perfect," Margaret whispered, as the cloth was pulled away, revealing the gleaming brass plaque. The metal caught the sunlight, making the engraved words almost appear to glow. "Patricia Keller, 1958-1992. Truth endures longer than silence." Father Brendan O'Malley led a brief prayer, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. The elderly priest had aged considerably during the investigation and trial, the weight of community secrets visibly bending his shoulders. Yet today, there was peace in his weathered face. David Wilson stood at the edge of the crowd, hands deep in his pockets. The neighbor had finally found some measure of acceptance among townspeople who once suspected him. When Margaret caught his eye, he nodded slightly, a small gesture that spoke volumes about forgiveness. James Walker, the district attorney who had secured Gregory Thomas's conviction, placed a hand on the bench as he spoke about justice delayed but not denied. "This memorial isn't just for Patricia," he said, "but for all of us who carry the responsibility to speak up when something isn't right." Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks as she rose shakily to her feet. The loyal friend placed her flowers beneath the plaque, her fingers lingering on the cool metal. "I told you we'd find the truth, Patty," she murmured, using the nickname few had ever heard her say aloud. Sheriff Bill McBride, now retired and gray-haired, approached with a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. The former lawman had carried the burden of the unsolved case for decades. "We got there in the end," he said simply. As the ceremony concluded, townspeople lingered, some approaching the bench to touch the plaque, others embracing Margaret or speaking quietly among themselves. The memorial had become more than a reminder of tragedy. It was a testament to resilience and the power of truth. Detective Mitchell watched as Margaret was surrounded by both old friends and new allies, people who had stood by her through decades of uncertainty and the painful revelations of the trial. The modest gathering represented something profound: Silverton's collective promise that silence would never again be mistaken for peace. The mountain peaks surrounding Silverton cast long shadows as autumn approached, much like the shadow of Patricia Keller's case that would forever linger over the town. The courthouse clock still chimed on the hour, the Avalanche Cafe still served its famous apple pie, but nothing felt quite the same. The resolution had changed everything and everyone. Margaret Walsh sat on the memorial bench, her arthritis-stiffened fingers tracing the new brass plaque. At 73, her body had slowed, but her spirit remained undiminished. She had become something of a local legend, the woman who never stopped believing, never stopped searching for her friend. "Some days I still expect to see her walking down the street," Margaret told Detective Sarah Mitchell, who occasionally joined her on these quiet afternoons. "Funny how the mind holds on to hope, even after the truth comes out." The detective nodded, understanding the complex emotions that followed closure. Her investigation had transformed her career, but more importantly, it had taught her about the power of persistent memory and the cost of communal silence. Throughout Silverton, subtle changes reflected the town's reckoning with its past. The county archive, where Patricia once meticulously filed records, now included a small exhibit about cold cases and justice delayed. David Wilson, once ostracized by suspicion, had slowly reintegrated into community life, finding unexpected compassion from neighbors who finally understood his decades of heartbreak. Even Father O'Malley, now retired but still presiding over occasional services, had dedicated a sermon series to forgiveness and truth, themes that resonated deeply in a community that had harbored so many secrets. The annual Winter Festival, once simply a celebration of mountain culture, had incorporated a remembrance ceremony. Children who hadn't been born when Patricia disappeared now grew up understanding the importance of speaking up and standing together. For Margaret, these changes brought bittersweet comfort. She had taken to mentoring young women at the local high school, sharing stories not just about Patricia, but about friendship and loyalty that transcended time. Her apartment had become an unofficial museum of memories, photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings carefully preserved as testament to a life that mattered. "The truth doesn't always heal everything," she often said, "but it stops the wound from festering." As snow began to dust the mountain peaks that October, Margaret stood at her window watching the transformation of the landscape. The white blanket that had once concealed so much now seemed less threatening, more natural in its cycle of covering and revealing. The truth about Patricia, once buried beneath 26 winters of snow and silence, now stood in the open, unyielding, undeniable, and finally, at long last, heard.